I'm turning the overworld into an underground ecosystem, complete with custom biomes that stretch from Y320 all the way down to bedrock. What wood would be most common in an underground savanna? How dangerous would a cavernous desert be? What secrets lie at the bottom of an obsidian ocean? Find out as we create and explore the Dwarf Hollow. Before we begin, let's address the elephant in the room. Minecraft used to support a cave world preset, just like it has a large biomes or amplified option, and the terrain files that handle that still exist in the game. With a little work, you can very easily have a cave overworld, but let's take a look at what that actually looks like. Technically, everything you need to play is here, but this is just a modification of the nether terrain, which means it goes from Y-64 still, so, bedrock is still where it is in the normal overworld, but only goes up to Y128. So it's not the same height as the overworld and technically only a little taller than the nether. Ultimately, very short. The sea level is at Y32, so basically the same as in the nether. However, deep slate still starts generating at about Y0, which means all that deep slate is underwater. What that also means is all the caves that generate below Y0 are entirely flooded. There's basically no caves that generate underneath sea level that are not flooded. You might be able to tell from the various colors here in the water, but the biome layout is totally messed up. And because of that, there's actually very few biomes that spawn here. I believe most of this is river and frozen river. And on top of that, the biomes that do spawn here are mostly empty. We get a lot of the features that just use a height range, like ores and lava lakes, but anything that projects to a height map still projects to a height map. So there's no trees, no grass, no plants. It's basically entirely just stone, grass, dirt, and water. This is obviously not particularly fun to play in, and even if we had all of the trees and grass and things, it wouldn't be particularly interesting as a cave world. It would mostly just be the overworld that happens to have way more stone. So let's talk about my goals for making a truly underground overworld. Right now, what we're seeing here is basically one large cavern that overlooks the ocean that covers most of the entire bottom section of the world. Very similar to the nether, and in the nether, this works. But for my overworld, I want much more of a layered kind of system. The oceans will still be at the bottom, we'll still have a sea level, but it's going to be probably quite a bit lower than this. And I would really like if we had some of this terrain here, like over here, we have this shelf right here. It'd be really great if we had multiple kind of levels of shelves. Not too dissimilar to what we're seeing right here, but much more consistent across the entire dimension. We wouldn't have a lot of these chasms. Certainly not those that would take you all the way from the very top of the world to sea level. To that end, I'm going to raise the height of the world above even the vanilla overworld's normal terrain generation up to the actual build limit, y equals 320. That should give us plenty of room for multiple layers of biomes going from the very top of the world through a couple of layers of shelves and terrain all the way down to sea level and hopefully, possibly even some caves underneath the oceans. I also want to fill this underground world with biomes that feel like they belong here. If we just do an oak forest or mega taiga or even something like a swamp that just happens to be underground, all those vanilla features weren't necessarily designed to look nice and be interesting and balanced in an underground world, in a cave world. And so we want to be designing biomes that look really interesting and exciting in this particular environment. Now, with that in mind, I do want this project to have minimal changes to progression. This is not going to be a light total conversion like my Frostpale project was. Ideally, I want the normal, standard Minecraft progression to be relatively untouched, as close as we can be. You'll still pretty much follow the same routine of gathering wood, which should be relatively plentiful, get your coal, get your iron, find some diamonds, and ultimately get obsidian either from lava or finding obsidian naturally to go to the nether. And then you'll eventually be able to follow Eyes of Ender to the stronghold. There shouldn't be any additional difficulty in finding food or having safe shelter, and I don't plan to change any recipes to make particular tools or milestones harder to achieve for this particular project. However, one goal that I am carrying over from the Frostpale project is trying to make as many natural blocks available as possible, even in these custom biomes. All the wood types if we can, all the stone types, obviously all the ores are important, We want all the same blocks that the overworld offers, we just don't want them necessarily in the same places, in the same way, in the same designs as the vanilla overworld, because this is not the vanilla overworld. With these goals in mind, I think we are good to get started on taking a look at modifying this terrain. So this is what I've come up with, and really this is only a very small glimpse of the terrain that we're working with, but let's start with some of the simpler changes. Of course, we have a bedrock roof just like the Nether, so that players can't dig up and just walk on top of the dimension. If we dig through here, then we'll see that it is just a little bit random, done with a little bit of noisiness here, until eventually it's just solid stone. The bedrock at the top of the world as well as at the bottom is handled by something called a surface rule, which, despite the name, is responsible for things that are not just the surface. Ultimately, what the surface rule does is before all the features of the biomes get placed, it's going to take a look at all of the terrain that has been set as terrain, as solid blocks, as opposed to air, and apply some changes to those blocks based on a set of rules and conditions that I can define. In this case, I've just set a vertical gradient that goes from Y 320 and then down 5 blocks. At 320 and above, it is solid bedrock, and at 315 and below, it is not bedrock. It's whatever else the terrain already was, and then it just does a gradient for all the blocks in between. Now, just like the Nether, I have made it so you are able to build above the bedrock. This is primarily just to help players be able to escape if they somehow find their way up here with ender pearls or boats or things. I also don't necessarily want to disincentivize technical players from using glitches and stuff to remove the bedrock so they can still build perimeters and things in this custom overworld. Now, unlike the Nether, I didn't make it 128 blocks above the bedrock, it is only 16, so it's a much smaller limit than the Nether. But ultimately, again, I think that's not a huge deal because technical players probably won't be playing with this, but the option exists. I'm going to try and quickly fly through some of these caves to demonstrate the sort of layering that we're dealing with. It's a little bit loose and it has some gaps, some caverns for reasons that I'll explain in a little bit, but we still have some clear delineation of shelves as we descend further down, and there aren't really any places, there certainly aren't any places, even in these big caverns, where you could go from the very top of the world, right about there, down to sea level. We can't even see the ocean right now. What we can see, however, is we're approaching the deep slate level. The deep slate is also handled by a surface rule done almost the exact same way as bedrock. We have a surface rule Y vertical gradient condition that says, okay, at Y0 and below, the world is deep slate, the terrain is made out of deep slate, and at Y5, or I think in this case 8, and above, it is not deep slated. I decided to keep the deep slate level starting at Y0, and that's mostly because obviously deep slate is much harder. It's just intentionally a harder and harsher environment to mine in and to be in. And so I think for a cave world like this that is really incentivizing mining much more, having the bulk of the terrain be stone is just a nice convenience for the player, while still leaving the important and cool challenge of dealing with deep slate as you progress deeper into the world where probably more rare resources are going to be. Let's continue falling down here until we get to sea level. I've set the sea level to Y-7, so quite a lot deeper than the vanilla overworld and even a bit deeper than that cave overworld that we were looking at before. The oceans therefore are not particularly deep, and I think that's really okay. Oceans are, of course, normally very accessible in the vanilla overworld, so the fact that they are relegated all the way down to the bottom of the world here means that they probably shouldn't have a lot of resources that are found only here. We don't want to be creating that expectation, that necessity that the player needs to come down here particularly early. Coming into Spectator, we do have a little bit of terrain below the ocean, below the sea floor. A lot of these caves are going to be flooded, typically based on whether or not they are connected to the sea floor. But the caves that are not connected to the sea floor are not going to be flooded. And we're doing this by abusing basically the aquifer system. So you can see some situations here where there's a little bit of water at the top of this cave. That's because part of the game is trying to make this whole cave included in an aquifer, but I've changed the density function so that it isn't able to, at least not fully. Normally, fighting with the caves that generate naturally under oceans means fighting with aquifers to try and make some of the caves not flooded. And so I've tried to make that fight as easy as possible on myself by just forgoing aquifers altogether, and then using it and abusing the system to make these caves filled with air instead of water. And of course, this also means that we have the classic lava level at about y-55. This is notable because technically the lava flooding level at the bottom of the world is tied directly to the sea level, and because we have lowered the sea level, there normally would not be a lava flood level in noise caves. The reason we have lava flooding here is because these are not noise caves. Noise caves do not generate this low in the world. They pretty much stop at the sea floor because the entire world is made of noise caves. And so only Carver caves get down to this level. And Carver caves have their own configurable lava flooding level. Now, I mentioned there's a reason we have some of these larger cavernous sections here, and the reason is I included them intentionally, but in controlled situations. I'm going to briefly and very broadly run down how vanilla terrain generation works and how I've adapted it for this custom dimension. The vanilla Overworld's terrain is made of several what are called density functions, which are basically just fancy math functions that all get overlaid on top of each other and combined and multiplied and stuff to create the rough shape of the surface as one solid block, initially stone. And then the surface rules all get applied on top of that to create the grass and stuff. And then the biomes all place the features like trees and short grass and flowers on top of that. Technically, the density functions are also responsible for the noise caves, but that's not important for this particular subject. And roughly how this works is you have a continents density function, an erosion density function, and a depth density function. These all get combined into a couple other density functions, the names of which don't actually matter. But how they relate to each other is what creates the relationships between the terrain. Specifically, it's what creates the transition from rivers and oceans to plains, hills, and eventually mountains. Where the continents density function gets particularly high, that's where you get mountains, and where it is particularly low, you get oceans. Where you get really low, it dips back up to create small islands, and that is where mushroom fields generate. Overlaid on top of that, you also have the erosions density function, which handles how flat or jagged something is. So you might have terrain that is particularly inland, but isn't yet a mountain. It isn't particularly jagged. It's a plains like this. And so it's mostly flat, but then you might get some areas where there's some hills, and that's where cherry groves will tend to generate. And cherry groves know to do that because they are specifically calibrated so they can only generate where that erosion is low, and therefore it is a hill. Similarly, plains generate where erosion is particularly high, where it is particularly flat, and also where it is inland compared to oceans that might be very flat. And I've adopted a similar system for my cave world, where the continents is particularly high. Instead of getting mountains like this, the terrain is going to be far more dense. There will be fewer caves, they'll be a lot shorter, and just generally less common. When continents is particularly low, instead of getting oceans, this is a river, pretend it's an ocean. The caves will be particularly large. There will be less terrain, and so we can expect a little bit more cavernous kind of connections between the various layers. We'll also add in erosion as part of this algorithm. So where erosion is particularly high, instead of getting flat areas like plains, it's actually going to erode and carve away some of the terrain that would have been left over from the caves and make those caves much larger. And that's where we might get these really large caverns where multiple layers kind of meld together, or are rather carved away. Whereas where we have low erosion areas, it's simply going to have less of an impact on the density of the caves and terrain, and it's going to be left mostly up to the continentalness. There are several other factors at play when talking about the overworld terrain, but as far as my dwarf hollow terrain, it's going to be pretty much left up to the continents and erosion. And so that's pretty much all that we have to cover here to get an understanding of how the overworld terrain principles apply to my custom dimension, which means it's time to return underground to the dwarf hollow. Now that we have the terrain the way we want and we understand how it works, it's time to start working on our first biomes. And in addition to that, I'm going to incorporate a couple of more surface rules. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted for this first biome. I needed to have something on paper, and that'll hopefully help inform the rest of the biomes. So for now, let's say hello to the Bronze Sanctuary. I wanted to go with a very red biome here, very Gallifreyan, just because it's something so uniquely and instantly stark compared to what you would normally expect loading into the overworld. For surface rules, we have a top layer of grass blocks and then 2 to 3 layers of dirt blocks, exactly as you would expect from the vanilla overworld from a plains-like biome. And so really nothing special to talk about there, but wanted to point out that that was a very intentional thing done with the surface rules. Let's primarily talk about the features that we've got here. These bushes are tree features. If you didn't know, the bushes that are in jungle biomes are actually just tree features. They simply have a very short trunk and then use the bush foliage placer. I've decided to make these out of acacia logs and acacia leaves. So you have, as you can see, plenty of access to wood. It is only single blocks, but it's pretty prevalent. And of course, there's plenty of leaves, so you can get those saplings pretty quickly as well. Trees are very versatile, and you're going to see a lot of them throughout the rest of this project. So if you want to learn more about how cool they are, check out my video. In addition to these large bushes, we have several random patches that are peppering the entire landscape. We obviously have short and tall grass popping up in a few places. We've got various flowers. I tried to pick mostly red flowers, though there certainly are some yellow and orange ones as well, because I felt they made sense. There are, yes, a few bushes as well, the new 1.21.5 bushes, which add a nice little kind of darker hue to the foliage here on top of the terrain. These huge red mushrooms are also tree features, and I'm really happy with how they turned out. We're using the cherry trunk placer as well as the acacia foliage placer for the heads, and I've made the head blocks red mushroom blocks that have no face on the bottom, and then for the stems, we have no face on the top and the bottom. Kind of looks a little funny on the branches here, but I think that is preferable to having a white stem inside of the stem if you were to break the trunk here. Now this biome only has huge red mushrooms, but I have gone ahead and used a place on ground decorator so that all of these huge mushrooms will place a couple of small mushrooms around their trunk, which I suspect is going to be a pretty integral food source early on in the game. I feel pretty good about this biome, so let's get to planning a couple of other biomes. I kind of want a bit of a savanna colored biome. I think that should create a really cool contrast with the red and orange hue of the Bronze Sanctuary. So this one's probably going to be more like a forest. I think we'll go with some birch trees, and we might do a bit of a fancier kind of foliage placer for them. Not super sure what, I'll probably test out a couple. I think definitely we'll want some yellow flowers on the ground, definitely lots of wildflowers, but probably also more dandelions, maybe sunflowers, even though that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I also think with the color scheme we're going with here, with the color of grass, the yellow flowers and things, even somewhat the birch and especially the birch leaves, it's going to make a lot of sense to have glowberries and cave vines growing here. It's going to feel kind of like a lush cave, but it should have enough to differentiate it and still have its own things to offer. And then I also think I want a biome that is dedicated much more to cherry wood. I don't want it to look too much like an actual cherry grove, so definitely going to want to do something a little bit different for the foliage, if not also the trunk placer for whatever cherry trees we end up going with. Cherry leaves do leave these petals. I think it'd be really awesome if we got that through the whole biome. So I think if we hang some leaves from the ceiling, this should look, for one, super duper pretty and really set it apart from a normal cherry grove. We're gonna want some pink petals here too. So it's just going to be pretty much a cherry grove with some extra sauce. Hopefully that works out and all makes sense. So let's go ahead and get these biomes created. Wow. Already, this feels just stunning. So like I mentioned, the colors for this biome are somewhat savanna inspired, but the actual function of this biome really is nothing like a savanna. It's much more like a thick forest, which again, I think is important compared to the Bronze Sanctuary, which is more like a plains or a meadow. I've decided to call this biome the Orichalc Highlands to kind of follow along with the theming the Bronze Sanctuary has of being named based on metals, although this is a fantasy metal. I don't expect all the biomes will be named as such, but I will try to incorporate that where it makes sense. I think the trees turned out really nicely. These straight birch trunk placers are super duper tall, much taller than normal birch trees, and so they still look much more intricate and unique compared to the overworld, even though it's just the same old birch logs. The foliage looks beautiful. The leaves don't spread out quite so far that it looks like a Christmas tree, so it doesn't really end up looking like a taiga or a spruce forest. It feels like something new all on its own. And of course, we have the cave vines with glowberries hanging from the ceiling to add this beautiful light down over and on top of the rest of the biome. The birch trees are placing leaf litter on the ground around them, just like in the vanilla overworld. Dandelions, oxeye daisies, and sunflowers are among the various flowers that can appear here. And we also have bushes as well as the short and tall dry grass, which add just a little bit more texture to the surface along with the leaf litter. Now, although we have glowberries hanging from the ceiling, you might notice there's a substantial amount of light hidden kinda among the leaves here, and you may have noticed a similar detail flying around the bronze sanctuary, some light that is glowing along the surface above the trees, the mushrooms, the bushes. And this is because I've included a feature in both of these biomes that places light blocks just a little bit above the ground. You can't see them because they're invisible, but there are discs of light blocks that are placed generally about 4 blocks above the surface, pretty much everywhere across the whole biome. There's 3 different kinds at 3 different light levels, so that we have kind of a variety of light level throughout the biome, but they're very consistently across, and this is done for a few reasons. Number 1, although I have mob spawning disabled right now, it's important that pigs, cows, sheep, and chickens are able to spawn in these biomes, but these mobs still require the ability to spawn under their normal spawning conditions. That means they need to be able to spawn on grass, which of course we have, but they also require a high enough light level. And since we are underground, there's no sunlight to provide that, so the light blocks help to light up the biome for these passive mobs. The other reason is for player safety. Because we're near the top of the world, the idea is these 2 biomes are going to be the main ones that the player is going to spawn in when they start a new Dwarf Hollow world. In the vanilla overworld, the player has about 10 to 12 minutes of sunlight to gather resources and hunker down in some kind of a shelter before night falls and they start to encounter more mobs. You might go into caves and encounter a few, but they're typically going to be pretty small until you are really ready to dive down into the caves and do some serious mining. However, because the Dwarf Hollow is underground, for the same reason that there is not enough light for passive mobs to spawn, there is enough darkness for hostile mobs to spawn. And so the light blocks help to break up those dark areas and make these 2 biomes in particular extremely safe. It does mean that the player is unlikely to encounter any hostile mobs in these biomes at all, somewhat similar to the mushroom fields in the vanilla overworld, but I think that is a small price to pay for knowing that the player is going to be safe when they spawn into a new world. There will be plenty of other biomes without these light block discs or with very few of them, so that there will be enough darkness for hostile mobs to spawn throughout the entire biome at all times of the day. The Orichalc Highlands look gorgeous. Let's go and see if we can find a floral grove. The floral grove spawns a little bit lower than the Orichalc Highlands and the Bronze Sanctuary, though it can stretch higher up depending on the continents in particular. But this way, as you descend lower, there are still going to be some pockets of relative safety. The floral grove does still have some light block discs, as you can tell from the foliage here on these cherry trees. However, if I turn my night vision off, you'll see that there are some areas down here that are much darker, that should reach closer to light level 0 and allow hostile mobs to spawn. For these cherry trees, I decided to go with mega jungle trunk placers, and I also gave them some very small roots that can stretch a little bit below them and reach into the ground. They're most of the time not going to raise it up off the ground very far, although it kind of did for this one. It's mostly just to add a little bit of extra shape and depth to the bottom, like you can see over here. I went with a mega jungle trunk placer because it comes with these branches where we can have some additional foliage to add a little bit more shapeliness to the otherwise very pointed pine foliage placer that I've gone with here. We still have a couple of the cave vines on the roof here because this part of the terrain is technically still within the Orichalc Highlands, but as we descend lower, then we start to see the cherry leaves hanging from the ceiling, and I've added some pearlescent frog lights to the tips as well, just to add a little bit of beauty and light, again, to the top of this biome. It is a little hard to tell when you're looking somewhat upwards at these cherry leaves, but above these cherry leaves, we see that the top surface of the terrain is made of tuff blocks rather than stone. Just like the grass and dirt on the ground, the ceiling terrain can also be handled by surface rules, and so that's exactly what I've done here. This doesn't really serve any practical function, although I do think it's important to give the player access to tuff well before they get down to deep slate level, because tuff is such a great decorative block with all of its brick types now. We have a variety of flowers on the ground, including of course the pink petals that are a staple of any cherry related biomes. But as you can see, we also have lily of the valley, some tall lilac plants and white tulips, pink tulips, and allium. I'm trying to keep the flowers that you can find in each biome relatively close in color to the general color scheme of that biome, just to add a little bit more incentive to travel to these specific biomes when you need those specific colors of dye. So far, most of the biomes that we've been adding have been in the mid to low continentalness sections of the terrain, which means they've had pretty wide open caves that are fairly interconnected. We've got lots of gaps that go between the various layers, and even some wide open cavernous sections where there is very high erosion. However, now I want to fly over here and take a look at some of the high continentalness sections where we have a lot more terrain breaking up the caves. We do still have caves and they can still be interconnected, especially going up and down, but you're going to find a lot more kind of dead ends and walls to block your progress. And so these are areas that I want to fill with more traditional cave biomes. I say more traditional anyway, but I actually have some really cool and fantastical ideas that I'd like to fill these with. First off, I'd like a frozen caves biome to fill up the lower temperature sections of the world. We'll probably use a surface rule to change the entire terrain of this area to packed ice instead of just the top and bottom surfaces. We'll incorporate some discs of ice in a similar kind of way to how we handled the discs of water in the Bronze Sanctuary and the Orichalc Highlands. And I think I might try and take advantage of some light blue and white stained glass to add just a little bit more of that visual variety to this biome, because otherwise it's going to be very solid blue. I also think it'd be really interesting to have a just completely out there kind of cave biome and have something that is made primarily of honeycomb. We'll use surface rule to make the entire surface out of honeycomb blocks. We'll probably have some like jungle trees, possibly logs coming up from the ground, or maybe we'll have them hanging from the ceiling a little bit closer to how we did the floral grove. Either way, we definitely want honey either kind of laid throughout the ground as little kind of like groupings of honey that the bees might have placed. Maybe we'll have them hanging from the ceiling or just a surface rule that places them on the ceiling, but I think we'll certainly have honeycomb blocks above that if so. And then I'll certainly need to take advantage of a tree of some kind, probably made of honeycomb blocks, so that we can have bee nests that are filled with bees. That's pretty much the only way we're going to be able to have bees spawn in bee nests during world generation, is taking advantage of the tree decorator. But I don't know if I really want it to look like a tree, so we'll need to find some kind of way to incorporate it into the terrain and make it look like some other feature. So let's see what I can come up with. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe. I make all kinds of content related to world gen, custom structures, and other data pack features that I'm excited to share with you. If you're excited to play and survive in the Dwarf Hollow, please consider checking out my Patreon. I'm not sure if or when this data pack will be ready for public release, so until then, my Wizard tier patrons and higher will be able to playtest it to see what I can add and what needs to change. Because this is a cave biome and intentionally does not have a lot of large cavernous areas, it's hard to find a good spot to really absorb and appreciate everything that this biome has to offer, but I think this is looking pretty close. Similarly to how surface rules are able to make the terrain deep slate based on the Y level, we can also just change the terrain altogether with a very simple surface rule to replace it entirely with packed ice, which is what I've done here. I'm adding basically like a greeble effect to the ceiling of this cave using block columns, very similar to how we handled the leaves in the Floral Grove, but it's just more packed ice. There's a lot more of them with a lot more variety in heights, and so it ends up creating this really cool and kind of intimidating icicle effect. I decided to incorporate the ice and the stained glasses with these trees that are intended to look just like completely frozen over. The foliage is a cherry foliage provider that is just solid ice, and then the trunk is made of solid light blue stained glass blocks. I'm also using a place on leaves decorator to place these white stained glass panes on the bottoms of some of these ice blocks, on the bottom of some of the leaves, what are technically leaves. Ideally, they all look like this, but because some of them have some adjacent blocks, they obviously end up looking like corners, but I don't think that's too much of a problem. If anything, it helps them stand out a little better than just these straight sticks do. I decided to keep the actual floor of the cave mostly packed ice as well, rather than making a separate surface rule like grass or dirt, but we do have some discs of powder snow, as well as ice blocks to continue to help break up the terrain here. Additionally, as you descend deeper in the world, the packed ice is going to get replaced with blue ice instead of deep slate. I'm doing this in the exact same way and at the same Y level that the stone becomes deep slate in all the other biomes. It just made more sense to have this be blue ice instead of deep slate. Now for the honeycomb caves, we had to take a couple of liberties, but I've done pretty much everything that I set out to do. We of course have a surface that is made primarily of honeycomb blocks. Those extend about 2 or 3 blocks down. And we also have discs of honey that help break up the terrain. So as you're walking along the honeycombs, you might occasionally end up walking on some honey, which of course is going to make it a little bit more difficult to jump and such. The entire ceiling is made of honey blocks, again with the honeycomb blocks right above them. And I've decided to make distinct jungle logs and jungle leaf block columns that hang from the ceiling here. The jungle leaves are persistent so that they won't decay even if they aren't connected to any logs. I've also made it so that these ochre frog lights can hang from these leaves. However, for the surface, I decided to incorporate the azalea leaves and flowering azalea as bushes. The reason I've done this is so that there are flowers in this biome for the bees that spawn in the bee nests to actually go and collect honey from. Flowers can't be placed on honey or honeycomb blocks, and so otherwise there wouldn't be really any other way for them to gather pollen. They do still stand out, but we clearly have these trees here that have the occasional bee nest hanging off from them. They're simply straight trunk providers that have some roots to give them a little bit of shape towards the bottom and look like they're growing out of the ground instead of being propped up over it. They almost look like termite hills, which I think fits really well and helps distinguish them a little bit from trees that you might find in some of the other biomes, or indeed the actual logs that are hanging from the ceiling here. And then the last thing that I've added is these rocks made of raw gold that are peppered pretty heavily throughout the entire biome. I figured this would be important so that there was clearly something valuable that was worth coming to this biome for, because otherwise it's just kind of visually interesting, but not altogether exciting from a block gathering perspective, unless you specifically need jungle logs or currently oak logs, because this is the only place to get those. The next biome that I'd like to work on is a desert-like biome. It should be relatively straightforward, which is why I want to make sure that I'm adding some things that are a little bit more intricate to help break it up from the vanilla overworld. Of course, for the surface, we're going to make it primarily sand, probably 2 to 3 layers deep, and there will be sandstone blocks underneath. The terrain in the Dwarf Hollow is generally pretty flat and shelf-like, so there should be plenty of room for cacti to be able to generate without ending up trying to spawn where they would be adjacent to a solid block and can't be placed. We'll also, of course, take lots of advantage of the new short and tall dry grass, and I have a really interesting idea for how I want to incorporate red sand that's going to take advantage of concentric rings of granite with then dripstone blocks in the middle, including some pointed dripstone. This is going to be the main way that we visually break up the otherwise very standard deserty type biome. The other thing I think I'm going to do right now is work on the ore distribution. Obviously, mining is very important for normal Minecraft progression anyway, and especially so when you are in a mining or cave dimension like the Dwarf Hollow. So it's going to be really important that the ores feel like they are in places that make sense based on the rather vertical progression that I'm expecting players to take. Coal is of course going to be pretty common up higher in the world, but I am going to make sure that there is some coal much lower in the world as well. It's just going to be less common. Even though there aren't mountains in the Dwarf Hollow, I am still going to have iron generate pretty commonly up near the top of the world, but we'll also make sure that there is way more iron, again, way deeper down in the world. Copper, however, is still going to generate relatively large in quantity and in size of vein, but primarily in the mid to high sections of the world and not very low in the world. Additionally, there won't be any up at the top of the world like there is with iron. Now, as we get lower into the deep slate sections of the world, we of course are going to have gold, and naturally it's going to actually be deep slate gold ore. I just happened to grab the stone variant. There will also be lapis ore, but this is going to be most of the time buried, very similar to how it's handled in the vanilla overworld. And redstone is going to end up becoming very common the deeper you go in the world, however only up to a point. At a certain point, redstone will stop, and it'll be primarily just gold and diamonds. Balancing the frequency of diamonds is of course one of the hardest and most important parts of worldgen when you're talking about practical application and progression. We want them to be most common deeper in the world, but not so common that it is trivial to get them once you get down there. So we'll probably end up coming with a particularly complicated system for the diamond ore that takes advantage of multiple placed features, each with different rarities and frequencies and such. Now, emerald ore is going to be exclusive to certain biomes, probably primarily the cave biomes like the frozen caves here. It's still going to be relatively rare, especially because there will be way more spawning chances for them because there's so much more terrain. So with all those ideas, let's get that implemented. Let's start here in what I'm calling the dry midlands. This is going to generate in about the middle of the dimension, so still within the stone layer up to a certain point, but below the Bronze Sanctuary and the Orichalc Highlands. As you can see, most of the surface is made of sand. We have some sandstone underneath that, and we also have sandstone on the ceiling surface as well. I'm making the cacti generate based on a noise distribution, so they aren't uniform throughout the entire biome. They're often going to be in these larger clusters that then kind of even out and become relatively flat and sandy, where we give way more to the tall and short dry grass. And this is an example of where we have this really awesome concentric ring kind of situation where we go from red sandstone to red sand to granite, and then ultimately to these big pillars of dripstone and pointed dripstone. I'm achieving this with a combination of two features. First off, the surface gets changed into this concentric ring kind of shape, though with a bit of noise, using a geode feature. It's set to be able to replace any of these surface blocks, so basically sand and sandstone, but importantly, not air. So you may not even really be able to tell that this is a geode. The result of this is a filling layer that is just solid dripstone blocks, and then we're using a second feature to place these columns of dripstone and pointed dripstone on top of that. Specifically, this is a vegetation patch feature. Vegetation patches are a really powerful feature that I've talked about in passing, and this is one of their most unique applications that they are really able to handle extremely well. This is a very basic example, but an example nonetheless of a concept called feature stacking. Because vegetation patches can list specific blocks that they're able to replace and also be able to place features 100% of the time on top of those blocks that they replace, you can reliably place features on top of already existing blocks. So the vegetation patch is set to only replace dripstone blocks. It sets those to be dripstone blocks and then places a feature on top of those dripstone blocks that is a block column of either dripstone or pointed dripstone. I'm doing a little bit more complicated stuff with random patches to add a little bit of noise and also placing these features several times with a slightly higher count, and that's why we have such staggeringly tall columns like this compared to some that are much shorter like the ones back here. I think these add just a really impressive effect to the surface of this biome and really help break up the otherwise, again, very plain, very sandy, typical desert that you would expect. Now, because of the sandstone roof, the dry Midlands are not a particularly great place to check on the ore distribution, so let's fly around a little bit and see if we can find some coal, iron, and copper to take a look at. Up here at the very top of the Bronze Sanctuary, we can see exactly what I was talking about with the iron. It is extremely concentrated at the very top of the world, but as you get lower, it's going to become less common. On the flip side, while we do have some coal here and here, that's actually going to become more common the lower in the world we get up to a certain point. Right around here is probably where we're going to find the coal most frequently. So we've got some there, some over there. There's one right behind me. Plenty of coal to go around. As we get deeper, we'll start to see some copper pop up as well, but that's ultimately going to stop before we get down to deep slate level. Let's fall through this floral grove down to the deep slate level where we'll start to see some gold and even a little bit of redstone pretty high up in the world, but that's going to become more common as we get lower for sure. Unlike in the dry Midlands where the ceiling is made of sandstone, the tough ceiling here in the floral grove will be able to support ores being placed in it. Got a little bit of lapis exposed right there, some gold ore, a nice big chunk right there. And we actually have this carver cave right here that's exposing some more ores, including the iron that's going to get more common now that we're getting lower in the world, and coal that has now resumed generation, though it's going to be far less common than it is up in the higher sections of the world. As we get down to the ocean, we should start to see diamonds pop up, and we're actually able to see quite a lot of them. So we may look into reducing the frequency of diamonds even when they are not exposed to air, because you can see them so much more easily here in the water. But we still want diamonds to be about as frequent to find as the vanilla overworld because they are such an important tool for especially late game progression. So just reducing them because they are a little bit easier to find isn't necessarily the answer. We'll need to find other ways to make them more interesting to collect. Where previously the frozen cave was pretty dominated by a lot of these blues, we now have the ores that do help break it up quite a bit. They do stand out quite a bit, but I don't see this as too much of a problem because ultimately mining in here should still feel pretty similar to mining in any other biome here in the Dwarf Hollow. The only exception is it's much slipperier and you can't collect the blocks that you're mining otherwise besides ores without Silk Touch. It was a little tricky to find, but I have found a little emerald ore tucked in this corner behind the coal ore here. It isn't able to generate inside the icicles, so finding it on the ceiling of frozen caves is a little bit difficult, but on the floors should generally be easier. I think I was just getting very unlucky. I'm actually using two emerald ore placed features, one that is just pretty typical, pretty uniform, and doesn't have any chance to discard the chance when exposed to air, but there's also an extra emerald placed feature that is able to discard the chance if it's exposed to air, and that is going to typically be lower down in the world. So you can find emeralds more frequently the lower you are up to a certain point, but you're going to have to dig for them rather than hope to see them like higher up in the world. Next up, I think I'd like to work on some more forest biomes, particularly those that are going to spawn in the middle and lower sections of the world. These are going to have far less light associated with them, so they're going to be a lot more dangerous and hostile, and so should have more valuable blocks in them. So one biome I think I'd like is a dark wood type of situation. We'll use dark logs along with dark oak leaves, but I think I'll make it a little bit more overgrown than a typical dark forest, probably by incorporating vines hanging off from the leaves or possibly from the ceiling. I also think to help distinguish this from vanilla overworld biomes like the dark forest, probably aren't going to have any mushrooms in here, but I am going to have patches of skulk. Basically, we'll probably have this biome instead of the deep dark, and so there will be skulk blocks, skulk sensors, skulk catalysts, and skulk shriekers all spread throughout here. These skulk shriekers won't be able to spawn wardens. We'll leave that to the ancient city, which I'll probably end up also making spawn in this biome, but that's going to come later. We also don't have spruce wood available yet, so we'll want somewhat of a snowy biome, in contrast to the frozen caves, which are far more icy. There will still be ice here. We'll have some ice discs just like before, but chiefly it's going to be snow, and this is where we're going to have some spruce trees, probably a variation of the spruce foliage placer, as well as some of the pine foliage placers. Very similar to vanilla taigas. And then, while not technically a forest, I think it is important to have a swamp-like biome. Obviously, it's not going to be quite like the vanilla swamps that are very waterlogged, usually near a shallow ocean type situation, but we can fix that by having a lot of water kind of spread throughout, both with discs and or with other features like deltas. And this will be where the player will be able to get mangrove logs and mangrove roots. Very similar to what they would find normally in a mangrove swamp, though we'll probably use a different trunk and or foliage placer to give it a little bit more variety. I'm thinking this is also where clay will be primarily accessible, though we may add it to other biomes later on. So let's get to implementing those ideas. The shadow woods tend to generate in more of the mid-continentalness sections of the terrain, and so while there are quite a lot of caves, as you can see from Spectator in here, they're a little bit thinner and lower, not quite as intricate and non-dense as in the higher continentalness sections where we have the cave biomes, but still relatively small individually, even where they do connect, not getting a lot of caverns to really examine and appreciate the whole biome like we got to with the dry midlands. But we can see this does largely look like a pretty standard dark oak forest that is somehow mixed with a jungle. We have these really bright green leaves that are pretty close to the normal dark oak color, and same with the grass as well. But because of the vines, it does feel fairly jungly. Covering the ground, we of course have the leaf litter that is being placed by the tree features, and then we also have the short and tall grass, some firefly bushes spread around, and then some assorted blue flowers like these blue orchids, cornflowers, and even pitcher plants. Of course, you can't explore the shadow woods without noticing the huge patches of skulk that are spread throughout. It's not quite as overwhelming and all-encompassing as the deep dark. I have shrunk the size of these patches compared to that vanilla biome so that it doesn't just become completely covered with skulk like it does in the vanilla overworld. But there is enough here that it does feel very dominant and can track up all the way up these trunks, but isn't able to replace them. Just the skulk veins are able to gather up there. If I turn off night vision, it's going to be a lot easier to tell that there is no light in this biome. This is intended to be a very dark and very hostile biome. I didn't point it out earlier, but without night vision, you can tell very similar kind of feel for the dry midlands as well. We don't have mob spawning turned on, so you can't see the hostile mobs, but there's only a few places where we can see a very gentle glow of some low light level discs and some very large gaps between them where hostile mobs are going to be able to spawn. Here in the powdered waste biome, we can tell that there is quite a bit more light, and that's because this can generate a little bit higher up in the world. It can be on the same level as the Orichalc Highlands, but can also go deeper in the world. I have made the surface of the powdered wastes snow blocks using surface rules, but we also have some vegetation patches to place just consistent grass blocks on the surface, and then are placing a feature that has a weighted state provider to place either tall grass, ferns, short grass, tall ferns, or of course snow layers on top. We have a pretty wide range of trees here thanks to the foliage provider accepting some ranges for the radius. So we have this really big and bushy pine tree right here, but we also have a couple that are just these cute little tiny toothpicks. And those are broken up with some spruce trees that are also of varying heights and widths and densities. As you can see, to help with some of the color cohesion, I've also made the ceiling surface made of calcite, since it is a white stone-like block, and the stone ores are able to be placed inside of it. We obviously still have these sections where the stone is shining through on these cliffs, since the calcite only goes up 2 or 3 blocks depending on the terrain, but I still think this is a really cool effect that just makes the whole biome feel very kind of chill and very white, with all these beautiful dark greens of the spruce leaves. This swamp biome might be one of my favorite biomes so far, and I've taken to calling it the Grimstone Grotto. Like with the Floral Grove, the top surface is made of tuff blocks, and then the bottom surface, the floor, is made of primarily mud blocks. We're using some vegetation patches to place some moss blocks that have mushrooms, drip leaves, and other vegetation on top of them. And then in addition to these mangrove trees, which are instead using cherry leaf placers, I also have these roots hanging from the ceiling. They start as muddy mangrove roots and then become unfilled mangrove roots, and they have a chance to have hanging roots coming off from them. It ends up creating this really kind of dank and dismal kind of feeling, like you're trapped, almost suffocated under this thick, swampy air. As you can see, we also have huge mushrooms here, including the first appearance of huge brown mushrooms. These ones are pretty fancy. They use a bending trunk provider and then some pine foliage placers, just like with the cherry trees from the Floral Grove. And then for the huge red mushrooms, I'm once again using the Ega jungle tree trunk placer, and this time using the dark oak foliage placer to get these nice rounded heads. The red mushrooms are much less common, but they can be way taller compared to the brown mushrooms that are pretty common but much shorter. And I think this helps make up for the fact that up till now there haven't been a lot of huge brown mushrooms, so if you need a lot of them, this is the place to get them relatively easily. Of course, this is also a dark biome with very little in the way of light, but there is some, as you can see. We're making very good headway on the terrestrial biomes, but I think it's time to add some spice to the ocean down here at the bottom of the world. We're so deep now that the very top of the world actually isn't rendering, which is why we're getting these beams of light with my shaders. It's simply because the game doesn't realize that there are blocks up there that are blocking the sunlight, which is such a cool effect. However, beyond these beams of light, which of course are only here because I have shaders on, the oceans are extremely dark and barren. So we definitely want to brighten them up and give them some visual variety and reason to travel down here. Of course, kelp and seagrass are the most obvious ocean-related blocks that we'll want to have here, along with, of course, coral, which I want to find a way to implement in an interesting way, though I imagine we'll probably also still take advantage of the normal coral shapes that are provided by vanilla Minecraft. For the main ocean biome, I think we'll make the surface primarily prismarine, just to give the player access to that block, since ocean monuments probably aren't going to be able to generate in this dimension due to not having a height map, or rather the height map being the very top of the world at the bedrock roof. For low temperature areas that are below things like frozen caves or powdered wastes, we obviously want to have a temperature appropriate ocean to be placed there as well. So we'll need to find some kind of way to have ice on the surface of the water. Vanilla Minecraft has a specialized feature that normally handles this. It places snow layers and freezes water, but it's based on the height map. It's the very top of the world, the very top layer that gets frozen in this way, which is why the feature is called Freeze Top Layer. Since we're underground, that obviously isn't an option for us, so I'll need to find some other way to replace only the single layer that is at the sea level with ice. And I have a couple of ideas for how to do that. Now, of course, we already have access to ice by way of the frozen caves, so that can't be the main reason to come to this frozen ocean. We'll need to find some other block to place down on the seafloor to make it worth traveling to. Since we already determined that this dimension probably isn't going to have ocean monuments, it makes sense that we would have wet sponges down here. They do need to be somewhere, and it might as well be here. And then something that I think would be really interesting is an ocean where the beaches, anywhere that happens to be above the sea level, is basalt. So we get these awesome basalt beaches like we see in real life. And then for the seafloor, I think it'd be really cool if it was made of obsidian. That means the player is going to be able to acquire quite a lot of obsidian from the very bottom of this particular biome, which I think is going to be pretty important since there isn't going to be a whole lot of lava to turn into obsidian without venturing even deeper than these oceans, and even then, there won't be very much. Later on, we'll have to make sure that there is lava elsewhere in the world for all kinds of purposes. But if the player wants a lot of obsidian, I think it'd be really cool if they were incentivized to go to a particular biome here in the Dwarf Hollow. Since we'll have basalt beaches, I think it'd also help to break up the terrain down here if we have basalt pillars coming up from the sea floor. And on that same token, I think it'd be cool if there were some basalt pillars that were dripping down onto the sea level, just like we see in the Nether. I think that'll provide enough variety down here at the bottom of the world, so let's go create some ocean biomes. This is a pretty good representation of what I've done to the ocean. We have this section over here that is primarily filled with these sea lanterns, lots of kelp and seagrass, and then some coral blocks that are kind of embedded into the ground. And then we have a section over here where we have a much thicker true coral reef that is using the vanilla coral configured features. All of this stuff, the sea lanterns, the kelp, and the seagrass, appears all throughout the biome, but the coral reef, the coral features, are being placed based on a relative noise threshold. So they're technically trying to check if they're able to be placed over here, but are realizing, hey, this is not within the noise boundaries that we're allowed to generate in, and so we're going to generate over here instead. The sea lanterns, as well as all the coral blocks that are embedded into the ground here, are being handled with geodes, which are set to only be able to replace prismarine and deep slate. That way we can get these awesome, cool, effects built into the ground without them looking like big bulbous geodes. Very similar to what we did in the dry midlands. It adds this really cool light effect to the bottom of the ocean that looks just as awesome when you're viewing it from above the water, and makes the sea lanterns a really useful resource that you can gather in large quantities only and especially here. I was able to get a thin layer of ice in the ice flows biome that is just at the very top of the sea level. Underneath the ice, we generally have a pretty even spread of seagrass and kelp, just like in the regular ocean biome, although it looks like the shelf up here has ended up being mostly seagrass, and down here underneath it is mostly kelp. I think that's largely just a coincidence, but it actually creates this really cool effect. For the surface rule down here, I've just done gravel, and it's the same for the beaches above the water. But as you can see, I've also added these rocks of wet sponge. They don't really behave like rocks, but the forest rock configured feature is the type that I am using. So if you recognize it, that is why. To actually handle the top ice layer, I've used a bunch of disk features that place pretty consistently in every chunk of this biome. They create this really comfortable, really smooth kind of transition effect at the edges, much better than something like a geode would. And of course, the problem with using a geode feature would be it would replace a whole bunch of water with ice underneath, and I only want the top layer, which is something that disks are uniquely qualified for. I've also done some random block piles on top of the ice that are just more ice blocks to add a little bit of visual intrigue to the top layer here. I didn't go quite so hard as the glacial wall in the frost pale, but I still think this adds just that little bit of extra oomph to make it a little bit more interesting than simply a frozen ocean. As I fly around, if I feel like this isn't enough, it should be very easy to add some icebergs as well, and that would provide some additional places to gather packed ice and blue ice. And then this here is what I'm calling the Black Sea. As you can tell, because it's so dark, the surface rule that we're using for under the water is obsidian. And we're also using a surface rule for the ceiling as well to be obsidian, whether it's under the water or not. The surface rule we're using for above water ground, where these beaches are, is primarily basalt, but then I have some disk features that are placing some gravel to add a little bit of visual variety up here. As you can see, we have these basalt pillars in which I have embedded relatively common emerald ore as well as diamond ore. These basalt pillars are also under the water along with seagrass, but notably not kelp, and instead of that, I've done these patches of magenta bubble coral fans, just because I think they work really well with the vaguely purple appearance of obsidian. The ocean biomes are certainly the least important of the biomes here in the Dwarf Hollow, but it is still important that there is stuff here and they're not just completely barren, because that would be completely uninteresting. As it stands, they each have something within them that make the biome worth traveling to when you're looking for that particular resource, whether it is diamonds and emeralds and obsidian here, sponges in the ice flows, or prismarine in the vanilla ocean. There are reasons to come down here, but you don't necessarily need to make a point of coming down here really early. I think we have a pretty good variety of biomes now, so while I think I will probably add just a few more, before that, I have some global features that I'd like to add that will be applied to all the biomes, very similar to the ores that are now generating throughout the entire Dwarf Hollow. To start with, since this is so subterranean, I think it'd be really interesting if we had fairly large blobs of magma that you could find kind of throughout all the stone in all the biomes, regardless of height. This will kind of make up for the fact that typically early sources of magma would be the bottom of oceans, and of course those are still at the way bottom of the world. It also just feels like it fits. I'm also going to add some large ore blobs of gravel, just like we would find in the vanilla overworld, so that we have some early sources of gravel, because again, that is also pretty relegated down to the bottom of the world with the beaches and oceans. But importantly, I'm not going to do any ore blobs that are of dirt, granite, andesite, or diorite. I just don't know if those are going to break up the stone in an interesting way, and otherwise it's just going to look very noisy. It works in the vanilla overworld because you're not typically seeing so much exposed stone. But in here, if they were to generate all over the place, even in certain Y levels, they would end up just kind of, again, looking really messy, and I don't think it would look nice. Another thing that's currently missing is sources of lava. I think the best way to make that accessible is to make some lava lakes. These are obviously pretty common throughout the overworld. We'll probably make them a little bit more common here, but more frequently kind of embedded in the terrain if we can. They'll have a barrier made of stone, much like this, very similar to how they would generate in the overworld, although they're going to be much larger. We're just using the regular vanilla lakes feature that supports having a barrier block and a fluid block. Now, where most of the dwarf hollow biomes end up populating the large noise caves that are functionally the entire dimension, we do also have the carver caves, like I mentioned before, and this is a prime location to have dungeons generate. I think I'm just going to use the vanilla dungeon feature, otherwise called the mob spawner or monster room. So it's just going to be the regular cobblestone, mossy cobblestone with a spawner in the middle and standard dungeon loot chests inside as well. But we'll probably make them a little bit more common than in the vanilla overworld, maybe even based on height. Additionally, though I've been using geodes pretty regularly throughout the dimension to create these really unique shapes and applications that they weren't necessarily intended for, I'm going to use the geode feature to make some geodes. While we do have plenty of ore throughout the entire dimension, and I think the ore spread works pretty well, I think it'd be really interesting if there were geodes spread throughout the dimension as well that were filled with these ores as kind of unique mother lodes of gold, iron, even coal, and especially things like diamond and emerald, though those will be much rarer. These geodes are where I think I'll probably try to implement some more blocks like granite, as well as andesite and diorite, which currently don't appear in the dimension at all. That was quite a bit of planning so far, so let's get to work. Starting up here near the top of the world in the Bronze Sanctuary, we have our very first geode down here. It is made of a tough outer layer, a diorite middle layer, and then a deep slate inner layer that then has deep slate coal ore as the alternate inner layer, and that's how we are placing this with a random consistency. In addition to the deep slate coal ore, we also have a very small chance to have solid coal blocks as well to kind of serve as the, again, that mother lode feeling when you find one of these. Because it is deep slate in here, as you can see, we also do get the regular ores since they generate in a later step from these geodes. So you can get a geode that has coal as well as iron and copper, and potentially as you get lower in the world, you might get something like a diamond geode that also has a bunch of gold and redstone, just because there are blocks that are valid for those ores to be placed in. While I'm up here, I'll also point out that I added this new feature to the Bronze Sanctuary as well as the Orichalc Highlands. This is a waterlogged vegetation patch. It's very similar to vegetation patches, but obviously it places these kind of puddles of water inside of them. And this is how I've chosen to make sugarcane accessible. This is a pretty important early game block, especially here in the Bronze Sanctuary where there's lots of pumpkins. You're going to need that sugar if you want to make pumpkin pie as a valid food source. I did have to do kind of a cool trick here because technically, unlike regular vegetation patches, the waterlogged vegetation patches only place their vegetation feature on the blocks that are inside of water or, underneath water. And so to get the sugar cane on top of these sand blocks beside the water where they can actually survive, I had to give them a bit of a random offset. So they're always going to be one block higher than the actual block that the feature is attempting to get placed at. And then it's going to give a random one block offset in the positive or negative X and Z directions. And this works pretty well. We've only got 2 little sugar canes over here. There's 2, maybe 3 over here, and these features are relatively common throughout the Bronze Sanctuary, as well as the Orichalc Highlands. It looks like we are getting the ore blobs of gravel. This one has had a little bit of it fall, which is probably going to be one of the main ways you'll be able to identify it from the ceiling here, is if there's little piles of it on the ground. I've made it so the magma block ore features get more common as you get deeper in the world, so while you can find some higher up, you may need to get down to these middle sections like the dry midlands if you plan on finding a lot of them. We have a copper and an iron geode here, which is nice. As you can see, we've got lots of iron inside of it. Probably some of these are the actual iron ore feature instead of the geode, but we do have these beautiful raw iron ore blocks. And similar down here in the copper, we've got the raw copper ore blocks. We are getting some dungeons generating as well. It looks like this one actually connected to a noise cave rather than a carver cave, which is nice. I wasn't certain that was possible. But it looks like this one is a zombie spawner, and then there's also one down here, looks like a spider spawner. So awesome to see that these are generating where we want. I've made it so there's 3 different levels of dungeons that each have different rarities. So higher up in the world, they still exist, but they're going to be less common, and they're going to get more common in the middle of the world. And then as you get down lower into the oceans, they're going to be more common than the very top, but less common than the middle. And that's simply because there's a bunch of water down there anyway, so we wouldn't want them to generate super duper commonly. Lava lakes like this also get more common as you get deeper in the world. So this one looks like it's generated just below the deep slate layer, but as you can see, it has a barrier made of stone. But then we have 2 way down there, well below the deep slate level. So they get more common as you get deeper. Lake features have a little bit of a mind of their own, so there isn't a lot that we can do to force them to generate on the surface of shelves, on the surface of terrain, but they do have a chance to be able to do that, and otherwise are going to spawn relatively close to it. Ultimately, if the player needs to strip mine to be able to find these, as long as that remains an option, of course you're able to hear the lava, and so I think that's perfectly fine. The last thing I'll mention as far as global features is the infested stone and infested deep slate. I went ahead and added ore features for these at the same time that I added the gravel and magma ore features, and they're going to be more common at the very top and the very bottom of the world, but always only when they're not exposed to air. They have a 100% chance of being discarded if they are directly exposed to air like this stone right here. This will hopefully help counteract the ease at which the player currently can strip mine for lots of iron and coal at the very top of the world. I am still going to reduce the frequency of iron up here, but even still there is going to be plenty, and so having infested stone will add some additional challenge where there otherwise aren't any caves or mobs that could threaten you. Now that the global features are looking really nice, I think there's just a few more biomes that I'd like to add, and that's going to start with some additional cave biomes. We have some sections of the world here where there isn't any regular biomes, and we're not quite at the continentalness for a cave biome. Or if we are, we have a little bit of what's called weirdness built into our density function, where this wants to be something different than a frozen cave. And so to give the dwarf hollow terrain what it wants, we'll add a couple more cave biomes to fill these weird areas. Currently, we're using geodes to have really interesting places to mine for additional ores, and so there isn't a way to get amethyst right now. So I think we'll make a whole biome that is dedicated to getting amethyst. We'll have a surface that is made of smooth basalt. Underneath that, we'll have some calcite, and then the rest of the terrain is going to be made of amethyst blocks, in a similar way to most of the terrain in the frozen caves is made of packed ice or blue ice. Now, in addition to, of course, having budding amethyst and amethyst crystals spread throughout here so that you can make spyglasses and armor trims and things, I also think it's going to be really interesting to incorporate some purple stained glass, similar to what we did with the light blue stained glass in the frozen caves. And this will be a really interesting way to add some light with pearlescent frog lights. If these pillars are all the way stretching from the floor to the ceiling, and then there's these frog lights in them, I think that's going to look super mystical and exciting. Additionally, while we do have mushrooms generating pretty commonly through many of the biomes in the Dwarf Hollow, we don't have anywhere for mycelium, which is a, I think, important decorative block to include, and so I think we will make a mushroom caves type of biome. There will be, of course, plenty of brown and red mushrooms. We'll make sure mushrooms can spawn, so this might be a bit of a brighter kind of cave compared to some of the previous ones that we've been making. And of course, we'll still include some huge red and brown mushrooms, probably more frequently brown than red if we can. And then the last wood type that isn't currently accounted for here in the Dwarf Hollow is pale oak, and so we definitely need a pale garden type of biome. It is important to me that it is really distinct from the normal pale garden, so I think we for sure aren't going to use the normal pale oak tree trunk placer, and similarly a very different foliage placer as well, just to make it really stand out as a pale oak biome, but that is its own kind of thing. To that end, we'll also certainly have leaves and hanging moss from the ceiling, and I also think it'd be interesting, we might have this in areas that are kind of this mid-continentalness, very similar to the shadow woods here. And so there should be low enough ceilings that if we do some columns of oak logs, creaking hearts, and then more oak logs, that should give enough room for creaking to still be able to reach the ground. They just might have a slightly smaller radius to chase the player here. It also makes the creaking hearts more visible, but also a little bit harder to get to. You'll have to climb up to them rather than simply chopping down a tree. Let's get these biomes implemented to round out the Dwarf Hollow. So of course, because the crystal caves are a cave biome, we don't have a whole lot of wide open areas to take a look at it, but we can get a pretty good glimpse at what it generally looks like from this cave. Like I said, the surface is smooth basalt. Underneath a little bit of that, we've got some calcite, and then if you were to go strip mining through here, it would be just entirely amethyst blocks. But as you can see, ores can generate in this amethyst block as if it was stone. I do have some vegetation patches to place some amethyst blocks and budding amethyst on the surface just to help break up what's otherwise going to be very gray if there aren't any cliff faces visible. And on that we can also get amethyst crystals and amethyst buds placed. The pillars of purple stained glass and pearlescent froglights I think turned out really cool. They're pretty dense in this particular section here since this is a relatively wide open cave, but over here they're just a little bit more spread out. They feel a little bit more natural, and then of course up here we don't have any. There is a chance for each of these pillars to not have pearlescent froglights like here, but by and large they are going to have them somewhere between 2 and 5 blocks above the surface. I'm also using some geode features to help break up what otherwise might be some very noodly caves, so while most of the surface is this smooth basalt, where you see calcite on the ground, that is the outer and middle layer of a geode feature that is simply unable to replace air. The inner layer is made of amethyst blocks with some budding amethyst so that we can have amethyst crystals growing out of them, and then the inner layer is made up of air to, again, expand out these caves a little bit and provide a little bit more shape and noise to them. And of course, these pillars can generate inside of those geodes and end up stretching all the way up to the ceiling. The mushroom caves biome I'm actually really happy with. I think the short and tall grass here really helps break up the texture of the surface, which otherwise would certainly be dominated by these red and brown mushrooms, but not add a whole bunch of visual variety. For these red mushroom trees, I'm using a dark oak trunk placer and then simply a blob foliage placer for the top, but they end up looking very unique and bulbous because of the way they end up trying to generate with these dark oak branches. The brown mushroom trees are just very short, straight trunk placers that have some very short mangrove roots as well, on top of which you can have some brown mushrooms. And then I'm using a pine foliage placer for the top. I'm also using a place on leaves decorator for these brown mushroom trees to get some hanging roots coming from the bottom of them, which I think looks really, really nice. The brown of the roots obviously fits really well with the brown of the mushroom blocks and just makes them feel a little bit more alive and unique. I was hoping to get the brown mushroom trees more common than the red ones, and on the back end they certainly are, but I think they're having a harder time finding valid places to generate because of the additional requirements of the roots compared to the red mushroom trees that don't have any roots. Ultimately though, I think this is probably okay. I did end up making the small brown mushrooms way more common than the red ones, unlike everywhere else in the Dwarf Hollow. Another thing I decided to add for the mushroom caves is a vegetation patch feature that places mycelium along with the typical grass and mushrooms on top of it. And this is because I wanted the mycelium to be stretching through the carver caves, which otherwise do not obey surface rules. As you might have seen through some of the other biomes, whenever we have a carver cave, there is just stone on the top and bottom because the carver caves generate after the surface rules do. They're technically part of the biome. This difference here makes it feel like the mycelium is growing and stretching as far as it can reach, rather than just confined to what is technically the surface of the biome. This pale oak biome ended up being pretty tall in this particular section, which I think helps to really highlight the verticality that all the features exhibit. For the trees, I'm again just using a straight trunk placer, and for the foliage, we're using a spruce foliage placer, but that has quite a lower radius compared to what we saw with the birch trees in the Orichalc Highlands. I've made the forest here super duper dense, perhaps even more so than a traditional pale garden, so it should feel really kind of spooky and isolating as you're walking through here among all these really tall trees. I've also added these tree features, which are simply mangrove root placers that are raised pretty high up off the ground and don't have any trunk or foliage. I've tried to make them pretty common, but of course they do still need to find valid places to spawn amongst all of the very tall trees that are relatively dense. However, I really think they help add to the vibe that this place is kind of overgrown and unnatural. They create this really kind of bramble-like shape, and because of that, I've decided to call this biome the Bramble. As we can see, we are getting the block columns of logs and leaves hanging from the ceiling, like we've seen in several of the other biomes. I have hanging pale moss that is coming down from most of the block columns, though not all of them. And we're also seeing these columns that always have pale oak logs and then a creaking heart and then another pale oak log to make sure those creaking hearts are active. This one, of course, happens to be way above the ground, and so it's unlikely that the creaking that spawns from it is going to be able to reach much further than like this shelf over here. But I think their range is like 32 blocks, so I bet it could go even up to like over here, which is awesome. I have also included lots of vegetation to the ground. The pale moss blocks and pale moss carpets are getting placed by decorators from the trees, but we also have the short and tall grass, as well as some assorted orange flowers, namely orange tulips, eye blossoms, these ones happen to be closed, and then torch flowers over here. With that, I think the worldgen, as far as terrain, biomes, and features for the Dwarf Hollow is complete. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure yet if this data pack is going to be ready for public release. It definitely needs plenty more before it is truly and fully playable. I have lots of ideas for custom structures and custom items that this dimension could hold, but it's going to be up to you guys if that is stuff that you'd be interested in seeing. So let me know in the comments if you want to see more from the Dwarf Hollow dimension. If you've enjoyed the video, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you want to playtest the Dwarf Hollow dimension, please consider joining my Patreon. The early access playtesting of my Wizard tier patrons and higher is going to be integral to determining if and when this data pack can be publicly released. Thanks for watching!